Back in 1990, when neither of the Gulf Wars had happened yet, and this creator was much younger, former President Jimmy Carter was invited to speak at Buena Vista College in Storm Lake, Iowa. I happened to be a radio newsman in Emmetsburg, Iowa, and got an invite to the event. Carter's public talk was about the Constitution, but before that, he answered questions from us local reporters. The questions were about his presidency, his legacy, and his view of present world conditions. Those included the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the growing federal deficit, and women in the military. What follows is my audio recording of that press event, just a blip from the local news of the day, but fascinating to listen to 35 years after it happened, and just months after President Carter's death.
I want to welcome all of you to Buena Vista College today for the second annual William W. Stevens American Heritage Lecture. I'm Susan Cameron. I'm the Director of Public Relations here, and I'll be your host this evening as our events unfold. Please see me if you need any assistance. The format for the news conference tonight will include opening remarks by our distinguished guest, followed by your questions. And now, I am honored to introduce to you the 39th President of the United States of America, the Honorable Jimmy Carter.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm delighted to be back in Iowa and also here at Buena Vista College, which is recognized nationwide as one of the outstanding small colleges in our country. I also want to express my thanks to Bill Siemens and his father for establishing this lectureship, letting me come here to take part tonight. I'll be speaking on the presidency and the U.S. Constitution, specifically the First Amendment, and then answering questions from the audience. But now I'll be glad to answer your questions on any subjects that are of interest to you.
Mr. President, Art Hello, Storm Lake Times. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure.
One thing I've been thinking about is you've done a lot of work with underdeveloped nations and third world countries. In a lot of ways, Iowa itself is underdeveloped. It exports its young, it exports its resources to an outside community, and a lot feel it's not recompensed for it. We lead the nation. We're among the national leaders in population loss. And I'm wondering, how can we, do you have any ideas of how Iowa can forge partnerships with lesser developed nations that would be mutually beneficial and kind of reverse this almost second world status that Iowa endures?
Well, I don't answer your question. It doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with your assessment of Iowa. The most important measurement of life is not how many people live in a state. It's the quality of life of people who do live there. I would be glad to swap my few hundred acres of land in Georgia for an equivalent number of acres in Iowa, by the way, to grow corn, soybeans, and other crops on it. I think the main measurement of the quality of life is perhaps education and the opportunities that are offered to people to go from their home places to success, not just success measured by economic income, but what does my life mean to my family, to my community, and particularly how broad can this community of mine be? Since I left the White House, my work at the Carter Center has been devoted to a substantial degree to working with poverty-stricken people in this country and also in the rest of the world. I just came back this weekend from Haiti, the poorest nation in this hemisphere. And we hope this year, for instance, to bring about transformation in the lives of the people of Haiti who for almost 200 years have never had a moment of freedom or absence of tyranny. We also have programs throughout Africa and even in China, Bangladesh, in health and agriculture. But I think that what everybody has to do is just say, what are my talents? What are my opportunities? How broad can I stretch my mind and my heart to encompass other people, to learn more about God's world, and then provide through the parental guidance and the teachers in grammar school, high school, colleges like this, and higher university systems, the ability to make the most of our own capabilities and own opportunities. But I don't think that Iowa has anything for which you should apologize. I mean, Iowa is a wonderful state and outlook on the quality of life here, with which I became quite familiar in 1976 and other places, as being very good. I personally have visited in that campaign 115 our towns and cities, and I have never forgotten the friendship, the breadth of interest, the involvement in other nations and in our country's affairs that I experienced here. Yes.
Mr. President, do you foresee a negotiated settlement in the Middle East?
Week before last, we had at the Carter Center a forum that I orchestrated that was broadcast on the Discovery Channel 3 times already. It's a 2-hour program. And I think the consensus of people who met there, including my former Naval Academy classmate, Bill Crow, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dr. Brzezinski, who was my national security advisor, representatives from Saudi Arabia, including the ambassador, Prince, the Prince who's an ambassador from Saudi Arabia and others, was that there are only 2 basic options for Saddam Hussein. One is to withdraw from Kuwait, induced by increasingly severe sanctions or embargoes against his country. The other option is for him to be removed from Kuwait by military force. There's no doubt in my mind that the level of the military being marshaled now in the desert of Saudi Arabia is far beyond anything necessary to defend Saudi Arabia. And I hope that we can avoid military action. The only other thing that I'd like to add is that Saddam Hussein, as he feels this unbearable economic and political pressure, will have to have some way to save face so that he can back down from his commitment to stay in Kuwait and accept this change in his commitment to his own people. I would hate to see him cross the border of martyrdom and say, I'm going to sacrifice my own life, the life of my troops, the life of my people in order to stay in Kuwait. I think that ability for him to rationalize backing up would have to come through an Arab negotiated settlement where he can not be responding to pressure from Washington or even pressure from New York, from the United Nations, but have something evolved through negotiation within the Arab community. So he's either got to withdraw under pressure or, in my opinion, there will be military action, which would be a catastrophe for the people involved.
These events in the Middle East seem awfully familiar to you, and do you empathize with President Bush when he's going?
Yes, I do obviously empathize with him. One of the basic unresolved problems in the Middle East that precipitates still a lot of this violence, including terrorism, the holding of American hostages, is not being able to move forward from what we did in the Camp David Accords and with the subsequent peace treaty between Israel and Egypt and resolve the dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's like a cancer within the Middle East that always tends to aggravate whatever problems do exist there. And as you know, Saddam Hussein is now building a lot of his appeal to Arabs in that region on the fact that United Nations resolutions like 242, 338, and others that calls for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories are not being enforced at all. No effort has been made to enforce them in the last 10 years, and the other United Nations resolutions that apply to him are being enforced. So I do empathize with President Bush. I think so far he's handled this crisis with superb diplomatic skills, marshaling worldwide support. And I hope that any sort of military action taken by our country is done in compliance with and working through the United Nations Security Council. I think if we take this military action unilaterally, just using a few of our closest friends and allies who have an animosity towards Saddam Hussein, then we would lose the worldwide support that we have now.
President, getting back to the hostage situation, I was curious if you had kept in touch with any of the hostages who were held when you were serving as the presidency, and how has that impacted your life?
Well, as you know, I visited with all of them. They were released after 3 days of intense negotiations, the last 3 days I was in office. I've always thanked God that every one of them came back home safe and free. And I would say most of them have stayed in touch with me to some degree. When they retired from the State Department, or when they got married, or even sometimes when one of them got divorced, or when they got a job teaching at a university and so forth. When they wrote a book, they've either written me or some of them come by planes to call on me and Rosen and see us. We have, I wouldn't say that our lives have been transformed. You asked me, the other part of your question was, how has it affected my life? I think it was obviously the most traumatic and difficult time of my existence. That last year I was in the White House. I was dealing with all kinds of responsibilities, plus the tragedy, or potential tragedy, of losing these hostages. And since they all did survive, I've been thankful. I think we did it without any damage to our own nation's integrity or the interest of our own country. And now, after that period is over, I kept back $2.5 billion. And out of that reserve fund, which was placed in escrow, the International Claims Court has paid off all the legitimate claims that Americans had against the Iranians because of the revolution. I've been very pleased with that. Just this past week, 10 days ago now, Friday was a week ago, one of my best friends who had been in an Iranian prison for 10 years came home. We finally were able to get him out through private negotiations. So even, this month, I have still felt the direct impact of the revolution and of what took place in Iran. So it's affected my life, but not permanently in an adverse way. I've seen the survival of these Americans, and I still relish the tremendous outpouring of interest and love and care and concern and prayers and effort by the Americans during the hostage crisis. Maybe someone who hasn't had a question. I'm not trying to be choosy. Anybody who hasn't had a question, if not.
Since you left office, you've sort of steered away from the political side of things, whereas the other former presidents have been involved in fundraising, things of that sort, and even have acted as consultants. I was wondering what your thoughts were on a president who leaves office and then sort of uses that for financial gain. If you think there's something that Congress needs to do to possibly address it.
No, even before I left office, I decided that I was not going to become involved in any commercial ventures. I don't serve on any corporate boards of directors and things of that kind. But I don't have any criticism of those who do. Presidents, like news reporters or anyone else, are individuals. We've all had different aspirations, different standards, different ambitions when we went into the White House, and we have different commitments and different interests when we come out. I've spent a lot of time raising money, not only in this country but around the world, but it's basically to support the Carter Center programs, humanitarian programs, those promoting human rights, peace, democracy. But I wouldn't want my response to be interpreted as critical of President Reagan or President Ford or President Nixon. They've just chose to live their lives differently. In the last part of your question, I don't think Congress ought to get involved in this. We're free people. I like to teach and write books and work in African villages and in Chinese schools and so forth. And hold elections in Nicaragua and Haiti. Those are the kind of things I enjoy. And let them do what they would enjoy. Yes, in the back.
There's been a political question. There's been some talk that small states like Iowa and New Hampshire have too much influence in picking the nominees. And maybe the big states like California ought to be first. What do you think?
I'm glad California decided not to try to move their election up first. I'm highly prejudiced toward Iowa and New Hampshire. As you know, I came in here in 1975 in January, one of my first trips. Nobody thought I had a chance. I remember Gallup did a poll and asked people whom they preferred to be their next president. There were 36 names on that list. I wasn't even on the list, but the Iowa people put me on top. I think it's very good for someone who hopes to be president to have to go, as I did, to maybe not 115 different towns and communities, but to learn about life in Iowa and then later life in New Hampshire. I think this gives us a perspective that I wouldn't have had otherwise. When I first came to Iowa, if I'd had this many people in my audience, I would have been overwhelmed with joy. I used to walk down the street looking for somebody with a notebook in their hand, thinking it might be a reporter, and to see a radio recorder was sent me into ecstasy, and I never hardly saw a television camera. I remember one night Jody Powell woke me up. He was my press secretary. Woke me up in the middle of the night, and we slept in the same bed, double beds in cheap hotels. And I tried to get to sleep before he did because he snored so loud. But he came in and woke me up and said, "Governor, I've got us on a morning television program." And I said, "Jody, that's tremendous. I can't believe it. What kind of program is it? Is analyzing foreign affairs or what?" He said, "Well, we have to get up about 4:30 in the morning." I said, "Jody, you didn't tell me what kind of program it is." He said, "Well, let me just tell you in the morning." So on the way to the TV studio the next morning, Jody said, "Governor, do you have a favorite recipe?" And I said, "A favorite recipe?" He said, "Yes, you're on a morning cooking show." So I got on the program and took off my coat and put on a white apron and a chef's hat, and I cooked fish on the TV program. And but I got a lot of viewers then. Well, that's a good recipe. As a matter of fact, I cooked I think a largemouth bass. I'm not sure, but they had the fish in the refrigerator. But later, when I won the caucuses here and won the New Hampshire primary, and they re-showed that tape over and over, so I had a good chance to do that. But I think that to go into communities and to learn people and learn about and listen to small groups, answer questions, is very good training for someone who hopes to be president. So I would like to see Iowa and New Hampshire stay in the forefront with that extreme discipline of going directly to people rather than just doing a media or television campaign. Yes, ma'am, right, in the blue dress.
Mr. President, what do you see as the most important issue facing college students today?
Well, I think it's preparing yourself with a broad enough education so you can accommodate the extremely rapidly changing technological age in which we live. No one can really anticipate what kind of life you're going to face 10 years from now, in the field of law or education or medicine. And so I think that I would advise a student to get as broad a base of general education as possible. I would also advise them to try to take a foreign language. I think if I had my druthers, I would make it mandatory that anybody who finished high school had to have an acquaintance with a foreign language, and anybody who finished college had to be fairly fluent in it. But I think those are the kind of things I think are just not to be too specialized as you go through at least a baccalaureate level degree. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, in connection with the Middle East troubles, what should this country be doing for an energy policy?
I think we should at least pick up what I did when I was in the White House. I began in 1977 a massive, comprehensive energy policy for our country, where we deregulated the price of oil and gas, let them seek the natural marketplace prices, which didn't appeal particularly to consumers, but I think did impose some restraints on wasting energy. We had a mandatory efficiency law that applied to automobiles. At that time, the average miles per gallon for American car was about 12 miles per gallon. We mandated that the average new automobile fleet had to go up to 28 miles per gallon. We also required that home insulation had to measure up to very strict standards. We changed the pricing standards also for electricity to discourage rather than encourage the use of excessive amounts of electricity, things of that kind. We also put in a fairly strong commitment on research and development to build up alternative sources of energy. When I left office, we had 4,000 oil drilling rigs running in this country. We have less than 1,000 now. And as a result of our energy policy, we dropped the percentage of imported oil from 48% when I took office down to about 30% as a result of our policy. President Reagan, by the way, abandoned all of those programs so far as he could. And when a law required doing something, the Office of Management and Budget just didn't put in money to carry out the law. So we're now approaching 50% imported oil again. So I think to put back into effect those basic premises, which are well understood by everyone, would be very helpful. The Senate was debating today, I noticed, a law that would require that by the end of this century, automobile efficiency would go up, the new automobiles would go up to about 40 miles per gallon. I noticed also today that the 5 most efficient cars sold in this country all average about 50 miles per gallon, so it's not an impossible technological achievement. Those are the kind of things. And to summarize and to end my answer, there has to be inspiration or inducements or call for sacrifice from the White House in order to get American people to realize there is a problem, and individually we need to make an effort to do something about it. None of those things have been done in the last 10 years, and we've just gotten very wasteful again, far beyond what other countries have done. Yes.
Yes, Mr. President, with rapid and current changes abroad, do you believe that the current administration has lost sight of some pressing problems here at home? For example, housing, education, or national transportation?
Yes, part of that is because we're so broke as far as our federal government goes. As you know, under President Reagan in 8 years, our national debt tripled. We went twice as deep in debt during President Reagan's 8 years as all the presidents had from George Washington through me. When I left office, we were the greatest creditor nation on earth. Now we're by far the greatest debtor nation on earth. We owe foreigners more than any other nation in the world, more than all the third world countries combined, as a matter of fact. So we don't have any flexibility left. You know, I would guess if you put everything on the table, including the money that we've taken out of the Social Security reserve funds and the savings and loan payments, that we have a deficit this year in excess of $250 billion. That's an enormous amount of money, and $1,000 per person. And so this is, we live in this country, so this is what has hamstrung our country, and President Bush has inherited this financial catastrophe, and he hasn't done much about it. There's now a stalemate, as you know, on reducing the deficit because President Bush is insisting on reducing the capital gains tax, which would benefit almost exclusively very wealthy people. And I don't know what's going to come out of this quagmire, but I think that obviously you have to have some willingness on the part of the legislators in the Congress who haven't been willing, and also the White House who hasn't been willing to make some compromises and to reduce spending at the same time to increase revenue. That requires an increase in some kinds of taxes, which I think is perfectly called for, and which I think the American people would accept. I don't believe it would be politically damaging if President Bush said, look, I promised there would be no increase in taxes. I said, watch my lips. But now I see more clearly our country is in serious financial straits. He can blame it on the Gulf crisis if he wants to. We've all got to contribute a little more in increased taxes. I think the American people would say, okay, let's do it. But so far we haven't seen that much political courage in Washington. It might have to come after we get even further in the financial hole. I hope we don't go that way. Yes? Anybody that hasn't had a question yet? Yes, on the back there.
Mr. President, in a Newsweek article this summer, the 20-something generation was depicted as a do-nothing, indecisive generation.
Yes.
Obviously, this generation faces many important issues. What do you think is the major responsibility of this generation?
Well, I've taught at Emory University for this is my 8th year. I've finished 7 years teaching, and I'll be teaching the rest of this week there. I don't agree with that assessment that this is a do-nothing or a non-caring generation. I had 3 sons who went through college in the late 60s, and then we waited 15 more years and had Amy, and she's finishing up her college, I hope, this year. I think the new generation of college students I find to be much more serious, much more dedicated to taking their lives and making something meaningful out of it. If I had one criticism to make of the college generation, at least the ones that I know most, it's that they are more concerned about their own career and their own success in life, maybe than they are, concerned about what's what they can do for others. But that'll come with more. If I had, a group of students with whom I was advising, if the ones who would choose to go into the Peace Corps for a couple of years after college, that would be I would say that's a very wise decision. To go to a foreign country, to learn the language, to work among different kinds of people, and then to come back home, I think that would add a dimension of knowledge and experience and sharing that would be valuable for the rest of one's life, whether you spent the rest of your life in a large law firm or teaching college or working in some major corporation. One more question. Anybody who hasn't had a question yet? Okay, in the back. I'm sorry.
As a result of the Persian Gulf crisis,
yes,
the role of women in the military has gained media attention. And as a medical military reservist myself, I would be anxious to know what you foresee as the future role of women in the military.
Okay. Well, I'm a graduate of the Naval Academy. I was in the Navy for 11 years as a submariner. And when I went back to the Naval Academy as a president to make the graduating speech, it was very shocking to me to walk down the halls in Bancroft Hall and see, women in the dormitory and women as part of the Navy. But as Commander-in-Chief myself, I welcome this change. I think it adds a very, wonderful dimension to public service. And as you know, the law in our country now prohibits women being put into combat. And that's not necessary. But I've seen even reports recently that the Saudi Arabians, who have a very peculiar attitude toward women, at least as far as Americans are concerned, have begun to see the value of having women in Saudi Arabia in the desert to help defend their country. I think that the military offers a very wonderful career for women, not just in medicine, but in other areas of life. As you know, computer technology, the sciences, there's almost an unlimited list of career opportunities in the military. One other thing that's good about military service, if you only want to go in for 2, 3, 4 years, when you come out, then you're well prepared to go, if you want to finish college education and take on a job or responsibility of leadership, I think you're much better qualified to do so. So I would like to see more of a young women choose the military. There shouldn't be any reticence about it, no feeling that you wouldn't, that you're restricting your future life. I think it would prepare you, as I mentioned earlier, with the Peace Corps. I think the military would play a parallel role. Well, let me thank you again. Some of you I know will be here perhaps for the lecture tonight. And I don't have a written text, but I look forward to talking about our Constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Join me in thanking him.